In my family, we grew up waiting for the end of the world. Any day now, the final trumpet would sound. God would send his angels to smite the wicked, uplift the righteous, and initiate the apocalypse. Or so we thought back then. If you're from this tiny Corn Belt town, you might have already seen the news reports. You might already know one part of our story. The part about madness, murder, and the extremes to which some people will go for their beliefs. It's what the police and the media want you to hear. But there's another side to this story as well. Our side. Most people out here take religion seriously, but none so much as Father Isaac Graves. We were a family of 5. Father Isaac, my sister Judith, my brothers Noah and Saul, and then me. Our mother had abandoned the faith shortly after Saul was born, or at least, that was what Father Isaac told us. All I knew for sure was that we had moved across the country without warning, and that it was suddenly very important to Father Isaac that we never tell anybody outside the family where we lived. He claimed that secrecy was necessary to keep us safe in a fallen, godless world. But as I got older, I began to question Father Isaac's version of events. I daydreamed that maybe the real story was reversed. Maybe our mother was out there searching desperately for us. Maybe she was hiring private investigators and driving up and down these desolate county roads with her long blonde hair blowing in the wind. One day I prayed she would turn up on our long gravel driveway. She would know how to find us even though the property was huge, and our new house was hidden from the road by acres of forest. She would honk her horn and my brothers, my sister, and I would all run out and climb into the back of her car. And then she would take us someplace far away from here, someplace where we weren't known as that crazy preacher's kids, someplace where we didn't have to dress differently from everyone else or spend hours each day studying the Bible. Of course, I felt guilty for having such thoughts. I asked God for forgiveness every night, especially because, considering how things were going in the world, Father Isaac seemed to have been right all along. All the signs had pointed to it. The political divisions, the collapsing economy, the global pandemic. The year was 2020, and it really did feel like the end of the world was just around the corner. I was afraid, not only because I feared that my convictions might not be strong enough to save me, but also because Father Isaac had quit his day job as a construction manager. He immediately used his contacts to begin some sort of massive project at the back of our property, but he refused to allow us near it or tell us what it was. All will be revealed in God's good time, he said with a small smile whenever anyone asked. Maybe it was just my lack of faith, but that wasn't good enough for me. Prices were sky high already, and nobody else in the family was old enough to work. How were we going to live? It was raining the night that Father Isaac woke us up and called us down to the kitchen. On the radio, a local announcer was saying that the pandemic had gotten so bad that a lockdown was going to be declared statewide. It was the moment Father Isaac had been waiting for. He told us to go upstairs and pack our backpacks with everything that we held dear because we might never be coming back. He told us not to worry because he had made a shelter where we the faithful could ride out the coming storm. My heart was in my throat as I followed Father Isaac out into the rainy night. There was no light pollution this far from the city, and our flashlights revealed only more and more empty fields. Signs of construction were everywhere, but there wasn't a single structure to be seen. What had Father Isaac been building out here? Part of me wondered whether he had lost his mind at last. Father Isaac bent down and revealed a man-sized metal hatch hidden in the grass. He inserted an enormous key that hung from a lanyard around his neck, right beside his cross, and he unlocked it. "We'll be safe here," he explained, "until God's fire has purged this world of sin." One by one, we climbed down the ladder underneath. It was too dark to see much, but the space at the bottom seemed about as large as our living room back home. Once we were all inside, Father Isaac climbed back up and sealed the hatch behind us, and then he switched on the lights. People who saw the news footage must think that our bunker was a dark and filthy dungeon, but that's not what it looked like at first. The solar-powered lights lining those subterranean hallways were bright. The walls smelled like fresh paint. We had well water to shower with or drink, vitamin D tablets to make up for the lack of sunshine, and enough canned food for 1,260 days. According to Father Isaac, that was exactly how long the Great Tribulation would last. During our first night in the bunker, it felt like hardly any time at all. Noah and Saul exhausted themselves jumping on their newly made beds. Judith, who loved music, was thrilled to discover that Father Isaac had ordered her piano to be set up in the main room. As the middle child, I often felt overlooked by my family, and I was touched to discover that Father Isaac had remembered my love of reading and acquired 2 shelves of church-approved volumes. Noah and Saul's laughter, the haunting notes of Judith's piano echoing down the bunker hallways, the rustle of pages as I flipped through so many books. Those sounds still haunt my dreams. Father Isaac explained that he had nearly bankrupted himself with the building costs, but it didn't matter. The day was soon coming when worldly currency would be no good to anyone. There was a radio set up to monitor events in the world outside, but he cautioned us that we should listen for no more than an hour each day. There's nothing up there but corruption and tragedy, he warned us. I remember thinking suddenly of our mother and wondering how she would survive in the doomed world above. What would she have thought of Father Isaac's grand plan for surviving the apocalypse? I try not to ask myself that question too much, because I already knew the answer. She would have told me to run. She would have told me to get as far away from Father Isaac as possible, just like she did. Then again, if I had, I would still be up there, waiting to fall victim to disease, food shortage, and God only knew what else. Thanks to Father Isaac, I was safe and sound with the rest of my family. I no longer had to worry what other people in town thought of us, or about how I was going to tell Father Isaac that I planned on moving away when I turned 18. Dozens of feet of earth and steel had cut me off from the problems of the world. Although I had never been to an amusement park or ridden a roller coaster, I imagined that it was similar to what a person might feel when a roller coaster's safety bar lowers and the wheels begin to move. For better or worse, we were all locked in for the ride. It started during the 3rd month with a seemingly innocuous question at the dinner table. My youngest brother, 7-year-old Saul, wanted to know where the pipes went, the ones we got our water from and the others that took away our refuse. Father Isaac provided a thorough, scientific explanation, but Saul didn't look convinced. I wondered why he even cared. Saul was Father Isaac's golden child, rambunctious and cheerful. He had spent most of the past month racing his brother down the hallways on their miniature bikes or tossing a basketball at a hoop in the storage room. It wasn't like him to be interested in anything that he couldn't shoot into a goal. When I asked him about it later, Saul just shrugged, but when I walked past the bedroom he shared with Noah later that night, I noticed something strange. Both brothers usually snored like a sawmill, but I could only hear Noah. Peering inside, I could see Saul lying wide awake and still, his body rigid, his eyes wide and white in the dim light. I didn't know what it meant, but I hoped that whatever my little brother was going through wouldn't last. If it did, I would have to tell Father Isaac, and who could say how he might react. On the surface, our father was the same as always, strict but wholesome and brimming with faith, yet I could see the tension beneath the facade. As far as he was concerned, this was the defining event of his life, and he was staking everything on things going right in the bunker. A few days later, something woke me up in the middle of the night. Since Father Isaac was convinced that virtuous people had nothing to hide, there were no doors in the bunker. I was used to hearing strange sounds and seeing the flicker of flashlights as my siblings went to the bathroom or to the kitchen for a drink of water. What I wasn't used to, however, was the whispering. I lay there in the lightless bedroom, imagining the dozens of feet of dirt above my head, and asking myself whether what I was hearing might really be just wind in the pipes. Could that be why Saul had been so curious about them? Unsure, I climbed out of bed and made my way to the bathroom. To avoid drawing attention to myself, I left my flashlight behind. I had made the trip so many times I figured that I wouldn't need it, but distances were different in the dark. The voices sounded closer and then further away, and it wasn't long before I realized that there were two of them. Finally, I spotted the glow of a flashlight that had been abandoned on the floor. It was Saul's. I peeked around the corner. Saul was standing on his tiptoes with his head in the sink, listening to the faucet. Occasionally, he would turn his face, mutter something into the drain, and then wait for a response. I had been watching the confusing scene for over a minute when Saul suddenly stood up and glared at me. His eyes seemed to reflect red light, like those of a dog in a nighttime photo. There was no way he could have seen me in the pitch blackness, and yet somehow I was sure that he had. I backed away slowly and returned to my room with more questions than answers, and hours passed before I managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I found that I couldn't relax during my shower. My eyes kept drifting to the drain in the center of the tile floor, as though at any minute something horrible might come slithering out of it. After I had finished and dried myself, I decided to try a little experiment. I tiptoed to it, bent down, and whispered, "Hello." Of course, there was no response. No eerie voice, no dead gray fingers or black tendrils reaching up to coil around my neck. Father Isaac, however, noticed the dark circles under my eyes and my constant yawning. My reward for staying up late was extra cleaning duty, and by the evening, I barely had enough energy left to kick a soccer ball around with Noah and Saul after dinner. I usually played goalie while 9-year-old Noah and 7-year-old Saul ran back and forth trying to score. There wasn't much space in the empty second storage room, but at least it passed the time. That night, however, Saul didn't seem to be aiming for the goal. He seemed to be aiming for me. Barely 5 minutes into our game, he kicked the ball straight into my stomach, winding me. It seemed impossible that such a small boy could do so much damage, yet there I was, gasping for air. Ordinarily, Saul hated seeing anything hurt, even insects. He should have been running to my side to see if I was okay. But he didn't. My youngest brother stood on the other side of the cold concrete storage room, watching me suffer with a smirk on his face. "I know what you did," that little smile seemed to say, "and you'd better not do it again." I heard Saul whispering again a few nights later, but I didn't go after him. The truth was, I was becoming more than a little afraid of my little brother. Instead, I snuck into the kitchen and tried to listen from there. If I was caught, I figured I could always just say that I was getting a glass of water. This time I was sure. There was definitely somebody talking inside the pipes. The voice was deep, smooth, and masculine. It reminded me of a politician giving a speech, except that I couldn't understand a single word that it was saying. It sounded like gibberish, or maybe some secret code that only the speaker and Saul shared. Because regardless of what the voice said, my little brother responded to it, answering in the same garbled language. Considering Saul's other odd behavior lately, I realized that I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to tell Father Isaac. Just like Saul had before, I tried to approach the topic by asking Father Isaac questions about the bunker itself. Had he really supervised the entire construction project? Was it possible that there were hidden rooms or passages that we didn't know about? Father Isaac laughed and told me that I had been reading way too many books. And then the next morning, something occurred that pushed Saul's nocturnal conversations completely out of my mind. War broke out in the world above. The details don't matter, especially because I now know them all to be false. At the time, however, we were only receiving a single radio station, the only one that made it to the bunker. Everything sounded real, especially because it fit into Father Isaac's preconceived notion of what was about to happen. After all, pestilence was already here. Could war, famine, and death be that far behind? Even so, there were signs that we could have noticed. The reporter's accent was slightly different from what we were used to, and at times he mispronounced certain words, almost like something that had never spoken a human language before and was just imitating the local reporter's mannerisms. For some reason, the differences reminded me of the voice that I had heard in the pipes. With each passing day, the news became darker, strengthening our faith and our trust in Father Isaac. Instead of depressing us, the tragedies that were supposedly happening in the world above made our bond stronger than ever. At night, we gathered around Judah's piano and sang hymns for a burning world. A year passed that way. A good year for the most part, as long as I ignored the ominous changes in my youngest brother. By that Christmas, the loud, fun-loving side of Saul had mostly disappeared. He had become observant and sly, appearing unexpectedly and never forgetting an offense. Noah used to compete in roughhouse with his younger brother constantly. Now, however, he seemed almost afraid of him. I couldn't blame Noah, because I was scared of him too. It wasn't just the personality change, it was the way that Saul seemed to know things that should have been impossible to know. As convinced as I was that we were living through the apocalypse, I couldn't help from spacing out during Father Isaac's daily hour-long Bible lectures. I would let his words wash over me while I daydreamed about whatever novel I was reading at the time. No one had ever seemed to notice before until one night, Saul confronted me in the hallway. "Father Isaac might not see what you're doing," he warned me, "but there's someone else who does." A little while after that, Judith started taking over all of Saul's chores. I wasn't sure what he had on her, a picture of a K-pop star he had discovered beneath her pillow maybe, or even something more humiliating. But he was blackmailing my older sister. I was certain of it. And then at the beginning of our second year underground, Saul began to prophesize. It started around the dinner table one Friday evening. We were having a typical meal, canned green beans, canned potatoes, and canned beef, when Saul suddenly stood up. His eyes rolled back into his head. He gripped the table until his knuckles turned white, and he spoke in a deep, sonorous voice totally unlike his own. "At 6:06, the beast will awaken." After that one phrase, my little brother collapsed into his chair. Father Isaac was convinced that Saul was speaking in tongues, but what could his prophecy possibly mean? We all watched the clock nervously as it ticked toward the appointed time. At 6, Father Isaac turned on the radio. It was the usual doom and gloom stuff that we were used to. A war report, news of radioactive fallout, climate catastrophe, and more new pandemics. And then out of nowhere, the device emitted an awful staticky screech. The presenter and dozens of others screamed, and then the radio went silent. The clock read 6:06 p.m. It was all the proof Father Isaac needed. We had entered into the final stages, and it wouldn't be long now before the kingdom of heaven was at hand. Saul had been Father Isaac's favored child before, Now it appeared that he could do no wrong. His next prophecy, however, was far more vague. "The hour is come when the faithful shall be tested," he announced suddenly after prayer, the whites of his eyes flickering beneath his rapidly blinking lashes. "We must not waver." A few days later, Father Isaac convened a family meeting in the main room after breakfast. He wanted to know whether any of us were sneaking food between meal times, because our supplies had begun to disappear. He made it clear that there would be no condemnation or punishment if anyone confessed, but also added that the behavior had to stop. He had calculated the exact amount of food that we would need to comfortably survive at the end of days. But now, thanks to someone's selfishness, we would have to begin rationing. A look of worry and confusion covered every face, except for Saul's. He nodded along thoughtfully, but didn't seem nearly as blindsided by the announcement as the rest of us. Noah noticed it too, and from that day on he began to keep a closer eye on his younger brother. It wasn't easy. Saul had a way of disappearing and reappearing around the corners of the bunker's twisting hallways. He was always there to report you for cursing after you stubbed your toe or for taking a break during your morning chores. If he didn't want to be found, however, he was almost impossible to pin down. The thought that he was tracing our movements using echoes and the pipes sent a shiver up my spine. Our supplies, meanwhile, continued to disappear. The theft continued until Easter, when Noah said that he had an announcement to make. "So do I," Saul shouted, cutting him off. "Noah is the thief." Noah was flabbergasted. It was clear that he had been about to accuse Saul of the same thing, but by beating him to it, his younger brother had stolen his credibility. "You're not even eating them," Noah whined, as Father Isaac separated the two fighting brothers. "You're throwing them away." Saul stared at Noah. Anger had twisted his face into something unfamiliar and wrong. For a second, I didn't recognize my own brother. "Someone is watching who hears your lies," he snarled, "and you will not escape from judgment." That too turned out to be a prophecy of sorts, because Noah didn't wake up the following morning. To all appearances, his heart had just stopped in his sleep, but I could help but suspect that there was more to it than that. Noah and his little brother shared a room after all, and was it really possible that Saul hadn't noticed his death overnight? Not unless he caused it, I remember thinking darkly. Father Isaac didn't dare risk our lives by returning to the surface for Noah's burial, so we gave him last rites and disposed of his body the only way that we could, into pieces with the trash. We could hear Father Isaac sobbing in the kitchen as he swung the meat cleaver. Judith murmured a prayer and I looked at my shoes. Only Saul was smiling. Our family was never the same after that. On the surface, life continued just as before. The same meals, the same prayers, the same daily rituals. But the joy had gone out of it. We no longer splashed each other with our mop buckets during chores, and the soccer ball was no longer boomed against the walls of the empty storage room after dinner. Without Noah's steady high-pitched voice, even the hymns that we sang felt different. Meanwhile, our issues with the bunker continued. The lights went out in the wing where Saul slept. Father Isaac thought that maybe rats had chewed through the cords, but there had been no sign of vermin during the entire 2.5 years that we had been living underground. Later, several leaks appeared in the same hallway. No matter how many of them were patched, more kept appearing, filling the area with puddles, mildew, and a maddening dripping sound. I didn't understand how Saul could stand it down there, but the truth was, I was glad to see less of him. Father Isaac and Judith may have been baffled by the power outages and plumbing issues, but I wasn't. More and more I was convinced that Saul was sabotaging the bunker. I didn't want to believe it because that might mean that my other father's suspicions about Noah's death were also true. It was only then that the bunker began to feel like a prison. We were living on half rations in the dark most of the time. Constant exposure to the damp, moldy air had caused all of us to develop a worrying cough. Worst of all, however, were the problems with the water supply. One morning, we woke up to find the faucets sputtering and spitting a disgusting gray sludge. It was as though the well that we depended on had somehow gone dry. Father Isaac agonized over the problem for days, asking aloud whether this was a sign that we should finally leave the bunker. After all, we could live with minimal food and light, but we could not live without water. And then on the third day, the water came back without warning, flowing from the taps in a glorious clear flood. It was the most beautiful thing that I had ever seen. We chugged it down, practically shoving one another away from the faucets as we fought to drink our fill. We were all so desperately thirsty that none of us, not even Father Isaac, thought to boil it first. A few hours later, Father Isaac, Judith, and I were hunched over on the shower room floor, vomiting a thin black liquid into the drain. Even after there was nothing left in my stomach, my body kept convulsing, fighting to free itself from whatever corruption had taken hold inside. I don't recall much of what happened after that. I drifted in and out of sickening dreams, one in which Judith was curled up nude in the corner of the bathroom, howling like an animal. Another in which Father Isaac smashed his face into the mirror again and again, begging for forgiveness. A third in which Saul crawled across the ceiling with his head twisted around backwards, staring down at us with hollow and empty eyes. Maybe I'm already dead, I remember thinking. Maybe this is hell. When I awoke 72 hours later, the mirror lay in shattered fragments on the bathroom floor. Judith, Father Isaac, and I seemed to have made an unspoken agreement to never speak of those feverish days. It was as though we were all somehow ashamed of them, although I couldn't have said why. Only Saul seemed to have been completely unaffected by the sickness, just as he was unbothered by the dark and damp. If anything, he seemed more comfortable in it. Father Isaac decreed that from now on, all water had to be boiled at least 20 minutes before use. For us, that meant less energy, and even more darkness. I came to dread each trip I made into the lightless parts of the bunker. Whenever I rounded a corner, I was sure that Saul would be there, observing me in the pitch blackness. When the family was gathered together, he acted almost normal, but I was afraid of what he might do if he caught me alone. 5 months later, Judith's pregnancy began to show. I knew the facts of life, just as I knew that neither I nor my younger brother could be the father, which left only one extremely uncomfortable possibility. A miracle is in our midst, Father Isaac declared. An immaculate conception. With the arrival of this child, perhaps our long time of trial will finally come to an end. I wasn't fully sure that I believed Father Isaac's words, but the strangest part was, both he and Judith did. Maybe I'm wrong again, I remember thinking. Maybe my family really has been chosen by God, and I just don't have enough faith to see it. 15 months later, however, the food had almost run out, and Judith still hadn't given birth. It shouldn't have been medically possible, especially considering how unnerved we all were. But I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. At first, Judith had been radiant. She had hung on Father Isaac's words, trusting that what she carried inside was a miracle baby. Yet as the months passed by, my kind and charming sister became increasingly withdrawn. Eventually, Judith had stopped speaking altogether. She spent more and more time in bed, eyes closed, hands folded atop her growing belly. Apart from her shallow breathing, I could barely tell that she was alive at all. Father Isaac, too, had taken a step back from family life. He wandered through the hallways like a lost explorer without a compass, muttering prayers, starting projects, and leaving the work half finished. He seemed to have finally reached the limits of his conviction. With Judith incapacitated and Father Isaac unhinged, the burden of maintaining our underground home fell entirely on my shoulders. Jobs that had previously been done by all 5 of us were now mine alone. It was too much, especially considering how malnourished I was, and I wound up focusing on only the basics, keeping us fed, caring for Judith, and plugging the worst of the leaks in the rear hallway. One afternoon when I was spooning some thin, tasteless vegetable broth between Judith's lips, her eyes suddenly snapped open. She grabbed my hand and placed it on her stomach, which was too big now to be contained by any clothing. "You know," Judith whispered, "this thing I've got inside, I don't think it's human. Can't you feel it?" Something pulsed beneath Judith's skin. It reminded me unsettlingly of a squirming fish eager to escape from a net. I wanted to say something to comfort her, but I couldn't find the words. And then the lights went out. It was the beginning of the end. With the power gone, we had no way to boil water, warm food, or control the temperature of our subterranean prison. During the past 3 years and 11 months, we had burned through more than just food. All of our supplies were worn down or used up, and I knew that the batteries in my flashlight were on their last legs. Unless I could convince Father Isaac to open the hatch, we would all soon be stumbling through a dark and suffocating nightmare. Judith screamed. I felt her flesh contract beneath my hand. Her child was about to arrive. I was fumbling around for my flashlight when someone tugged on the back of my shirt. "Leave," Saul commanded. I finally got my flashlight working, and in its flickering beam, I could see the terror on Judith's face, the beads of sweat forming on her forehead, the bluish veins pulsing beneath her pale skin. Saul watched our sister writhe and claw at the sheets with patient and passive eyes, like he already knew what the outcome would be. Leaving a child of his age in charge of a birth was insanity, but it was clear to me by now that Saul was no ordinary child. "Leave," Saul repeated, and to my shame, I did. I ignored my sister's pleading eyes and backed out of her cramped bedroom, unwilling to witness what was about to happen. I didn't think my mind could endure it. As I retreated down the hallway, I heard Saul singing some sort of lullaby. I didn't know the tune, but the words seemed to be in the same language that he had been using to communicate with the voice inside the pipes. I switched off my flashlight, and I listened to the echoes reverberating through the pitch-black hallways. The dripping of water, the screams of my sister, and that strange, haunting song. Several hours later, the screams stopped, replaced by an infant's wailing cries. As I switched my flashlight back on, I noticed how much dimmer the light had become. At the edge of its beam, I saw Saul walking toward me, rocking a cloth-wrapped bundle in his arms. Running footsteps came up behind me. "Does the child live?" Father Isaac wanted to know. He didn't say a word about my sister. This was his last hope, I realized. He needed this child to be a sign from God that our tribulations were at an end. At the same time, just like me, he hadn't been able to face whatever had happened in Judith's room. Suddenly, Saul stopped singing. "It is time for you to open the door," he ordered. Father Isaac hesitated and instinctively grabbed the key around his neck. He still saw himself as being in charge of our welfare. And what if Saul was wrong? Was it really safe to go outside? He told my younger brother that he would pray on it. Saul shrugged, placing the wailing bundle on the floor, and walked into the darkness of the kitchen. Father Isaac, meanwhile, turned on his own flashlight and approached Judas' offspring. I didn't see what was beneath the cloth when he pulled it back, but I did see the look of revulsion on his face. Seconds later, Saul reappeared behind him, the meat cleaver raised high above his head. It was the same one that had been used to dismember Noah's corpse so many months before, and now Saul was swinging it at Father Isaac's leg like a lumberjack felling a tree. Father Isaac went down with a grunt, and Saul redirected his strikes to our father's head. Even as the blade hacked into his face, even as the blood blinded him, even as he screamed, I don't think that Father Isaac was fully able to process what was happening. Despite all the impossible things that he had seen during our time in the bunker, he couldn't bring himself to believe that his own favorite son would turn on him. I didn't stick around to help. Instead, I ran to Judas' room, already expecting what I might find but praying that I was wrong. Just as I had feared, my sister lay lifeless atop her sheets, which had been stained inky black. My flashlight flickered. Then, somewhere in the depths of the bunker, I heard a loud metallic groan. Saul had Father Isaac's key. He was unsealing the door. With horror, I realized what my younger brother's next move was going to be. He was going to lock me down here and throw away the key. No one would ever know what he had done, what he had become, or what he was bringing out into the world with him. I raced toward the ladder, arriving just in time to see a circle of bright daylight at the base of the ladder in the living room. Slowly, though, it began to disappear. Saul was already closing the hatch. I begged my malnourished body for one final burst of energy, and I flung myself up the rungs. My fingers touched dirt just in time for Saul to slam the door shut on top of them. I howled in pain but didn't let go. If I did, it would mean cannibalism, starvation, and a lonely death in the dark. As Saul lifted the hatch to crush my hands for a second time, I stuck both arms out into the grass and felt around until I grabbed something. The eerily whining bundle of cloth that Saul had carried up with him. I pulled it down towards me and flung it down into the darkness. Saul let out an inhuman screech and leapt down after it. I didn't wait around to see if the pair of them had survived the fall. Blinded by sunlight that I hadn't seen in 4 years, I staggered around Father Isaac's property until I found the 2-lane road that passed in front of our old driveway. Nobody stopped for me, and I can't say that I blame them. With my ragged clothes, bulging eyes, and emaciated body, I must have looked like something out of a horror story. Eventually, though, somebody did call the police. It took the authorities a long time to derive a coherent story from my babbling, and even longer to actually investigate the bunker that I kept rambling on about. By the time they did, Saul and the child were long gone. I was kept under guard in a hospital room while doctors raced to save me from malnutrition and a host of infections that I didn't even know that I had. Meanwhile, a team of police psychiatrists tried to piece together the truth of what had transpired in Father Isaac's bunker. They chalked up the most unbelievable parts of my tale to the effects of lifelong religious brainwashing, or perhaps even fever-induced hallucinations. No attempt was made to seriously investigate my claims. According to the official story, Father Isaac had killed all of my siblings and then himself. It was a neatly wrapped and easy-to-digest story. The fanatical preacher who torments his innocent family and ultimately loses his mind. Of course, it didn't explain how Father Isaac had managed to hack the back of his own leg with a cleaver, nor did it address the strange black ichor found in Judas' bed. Simply put, it was a way for the underfunded, understaffed authorities to wash their hands of the whole thing. For me, forgetting wasn't quite so easy. After I recovered, I made some investigations of my own, and the results were troubling. It turned out that the well that was used to supply the bunker with water had tapped into an enormous subterranean reservoir. Even now, the researchers who I contacted remain unsure of just how deep it really goes. And what about Saul and the strange child? It was far more difficult to track their progress, and in the end, it was a missing persons podcast which provided the lead that I was looking for. Apparently, 2 nights after I escaped from the bunker, a woman had disappeared nearby. Her name was Jocelyn Strauss. She had been driving back from a late shift at a 24-hour breakfast spot when she had spotted a young blonde boy standing on the side of the foggy midnight road, holding what looked like a bundle of rags. He seemed pale and unhealthy, and Jocelyn had stopped to ask if he was all right. When he said that he needed a ride, Jocelyn let him into the back seat of her car. Apparently, the boy hadn't expected her to call her sister during the drive and explain what was going on. When Jocelyn began to give a physical description of the boy and where she had found him, something strange had happened. Her words died in her throat with a choking sound, and the line had gone dead. Jocelyn's car was later discovered intact and unharmed in the parking lot of a thrift store a few towns over. There was a bus station a few blocks away, leading most people to conclude that Jocelyn had simply dropped the child off and decided to run away from her life. After all, the podcast presenters pointed out, she had significant debt and more than one violent ex-boyfriend. Jocelyn's sister, however, wasn't so sure. She was convinced that the strangled cry on the end of the line meant foul play. It had been Jocelyn's weird passengers, not Jocelyn herself, who had gotten onto a bus and disappeared. Or at least, that was what her sister told the podcast presenters. For them, it was only entertainment, a fun little mystery for their listeners to puzzle over. But for me, finding out what happened to Saul was deadly serious. I contacted the bus stations along the route, hoping for a sighting, security camera footage, anything. For weeks, there was no response, and then a bored desk worker reached out to me by email. "It might be something, it might be nothing," he wrote, "but I've got something that you ought to see." It was a blurry photo of a bus station bathroom graffiti, 2 short, sinister lines that chilled my blood. "Be wary of little children singing by the roadside." That was it. No signature, no phone number, no further information. It was like my younger brother had vanished into thin air. In my heart, however, I know he's still out there, along with whatever he brought up from the bunker. I don't know what the voice underground has planned for him, or what will happen when its child finally grows up. But when it does, I have a feeling that my family's fears about the apocalypse might finally come true. Asada, Die Screaming, Meat Cashier, Malcolm Black, Dalla Magara, Justin Fotenauer, That One Woodsman, Die Can't Play, Dino, Deggy, MP Massacre 91, Leon Knott, SWAT, Kathy McGuire, Jimmy Griffin, Miss Eldridge, Dragon Slayer 048, Takeo Zarilla, Sanjay Anthem, Sleepy Shroomy, Mark Norman, Mina Lane Kidder, Richard French, yours truly, Omni Rubix, Son